soon at 4:30. Right now, let's head over to the Artesia Historical Museum and Arts Center. Michael Rebman is with us. Good morning, Michael.
Good morning.
And I asked Aaron if he felt the earthquake down in Carlsbad. Did you feel the earthquake over at the museum yesterday?
I did. I actually heard it before I felt it.
Amazing.
If you, for those of you who have not been in the Art Center, if you look up, it has those metal screens, and all the lights are on wires. So yesterday I started hearing the screens rattle a bit, heard the wires vibrating and hitting each other, and then I felt the actual earthquake.
Wow. They were a little more sensitive to the movement, I guess, before the human being heard that. I must have been in the car traveling because I did not feel it, because I just left where I was at Tate Branch and was headed back here to the office, and then that's when I found out that everybody else felt the earthquake. So pretty crazy stuff. So, but
well, it's not the first earthquake.
Oh no,
here.
Oh no, and it won't be the last. But I missed it. Anyway, let's see. Last week, you want to start with this day in history, Civil War, or do we want to pick up where we left off with Civil War artillery, which is what we were talking about last week?
Well, let's start with this day in history.
Okay.
It's an interesting one.
Yeah.
This day in history, Saturday in history, so technically not today, 159 years ago, the Gettysburg Address. Oh, goodness, how do you pronounce that?
The Gettysburg Address, perhaps?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, English is such a strange language. But yes, the Gettysburg, it was the consecration of the cemetery at Gettysburg, the Soldiers' National Cemetery. A few months after the Battle of Gettysburg, they were holding a ceremony to officially open the cemetery. And after long speeches by various politicians, President Lincoln gave a very concise but very impressive speech.
A lot of people wrote that some of the attendees almost missed the speech because of the length of the speeches leading up to it and then the brevity with which President Lincoln spoke.
Yes, it was only 270-something words, which is quite impressive considering that the person speaking before him was going on for a couple hours.
That's right.
But it was a very short speech. Has anybody ever read it out in the air?
I don't think we have. I do remember when I did go to Washington, D.C. and went to the Lincoln Memorial, it's memorialized on the wall there in the memorial, and it just it's impressive to think. Did you want to read it, or do we have time if you want to?
Sure. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives and that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, but in a larger sense we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
And that was it. That was the
Yes.
the Gettysburg Address. And, of course, that phrase, government of the people, by the people, for the people, that is the concept of the American Revolution and Constitution, but I don't know if it had actually been presented in that way before Lincoln. I'm sure other people had said it that way, but it seems like his writing and saying it that way seemed to endure even to this day.
Yes, that was perhaps the most concise way anybody has ever said it up to that point. And it's interesting that he says that people will forget what he said, but it's such a powerful speech. How can anybody forget it?
That's right. That's right. It is one of the great written speeches by leaders in this country or around the world. So, I think, did he write it on the train ride there? Is that what I read? That or one of the stories is that it hadn't actually been completed before the time he left for Gettysburg?
That's one of the stories, but it seems kind of improbable that he could write something like that on such a short train ride.
Right.
It seems like something that he probably spent a lot of time thinking over. It's probably part of a speech that he considered giving a long time before that he just kept in the back of his mind.
Mm-hmm. And that's what he used. So that was on this, not today, but on the 19th.
Yes, the 19th of November, 1863.
Right.
And it's interesting to think that while he's giving this speech, right at that time, there's fighting over in Knoxville and in Chattanooga,
Mm-hmm.
both in Tennessee. So while they're giving this speech, there's still people fighting and dying.
Yes, because even after Gettysburg, the war continued on for, was it another year and a half, 2 years?
Oh, another 2 years.
Another
Almost 2 years.
Yeah. So a lot of people think, because our attention span is so short, they think, oh, Gettysburg happened, Lee was defeated, the war ended. It was 2 years after Gettysburg before the South finally surrendered to Northern forces. And a lot of things happened to bring that about. The other thing that happened on the weekend that Gettysburg happened was Vicksburg fell. And both those events happened at the same time on the same weekend, and really
almost the same day.
Almost the same day.
Vicksburg was July 4th.
Right. So, well, that's interesting. I forget that there was quite a bit of time that passed between the actual battle at Gettysburg and then when the address was given, and it was given in November of that year. So, very good. Well, let's resume our discussion of Civil War artillery. You were kind of giving us a description of the types of artillery that would have been used in New Mexico and in the western states and other parts of the country. Where would you like to pick up there?
Well, let's go to the forts.
Okay.
Artillery, when you think of artillery, you think of forts. And along the East Coast, there were a lot of forts that were built, and the West Coast too, forts that were built to defend harbors. There are no forts like that out here in New Mexico, but it's quite fascinating to consider the differences. Like, think of Fort Sumter. It's a massive stone and brick building. That's a design they came up with after the War of 1812 when they saw how smaller forts were just no use against heavy artillery.
Mm-hmm.
So they came up with this idea of building these massive angular structures, multiple stories tall, made out of stone and bricks, and they would have thick walls, and there would be spots where there'd be cannons within the walls, kind of like an old sailing ship of the line.
Mm-hmm.
And on the top would be smaller cannons, and in the corners there would be howitzers. And what they found during the war was that those type of forts weren't very protective because they were developed with solid shots in mind, and during the war the Navy had very large guns that fired exploding shells, and those exploding shells would punch through the walls and explode.
Mm-hmm.
Out here in New Mexico, they didn't have that to worry about. They didn't have those massive Dahlgren 11 and 15-inch cannons to worry about. So out here, well, throughout the West, outside of like the ports of San Francisco, when they built forts, they just built towns, basically. So you walk around, there's no fortifications other than stockades at some.
So were the towns inside the forts, or the towns were built around the forts?
Well, the towns were the forts. Like, if you walk around Fort Union, you'll see like Fort Union, Fort Craig, all the other forts like that, Fort Stanton, that they're basically built around sort of like a town with a plaza in the center.
Okay.
But instead of a city hall, you have the commandant's home. And instead of like businesses, you have barracks and storehouses. But it's laid out like a little town. And some of them, like Fort Union, were laid out like very large towns. And after the 1830s, no one really built actual solid fortifications.
Okay.
Until the Civil War. And that was only because the Texans were coming. So at Fort Craig, they took that sort of town setup. They built a lot of earthworks. And so what that means is they would dig up dirt. They dig a ditch around the fort, take all the excess dirt, and build it up around the fort to create sort of pointy shapes
Mm-hmm.
that were very tall and very angular. So if a cannonball solid shot hit it, it would just hit it at an angle and bounce upwards.
Okay.
The problem with that, of course, is that they had howitzers, and howitzers could fire over the walls and explode inside.
Mm-hmm.
So that was unfortunate, but fortifications had not really been built to take that in mind. And at Fort Union, they did the same thing, but they built a very huge fort, a brand new fort, instead of trying to build around the existing one. They called it a star fort because it had a sort of like a four-pointed star in the middle with four more points at the various angles. And so the idea for that is that each point there'd be one or more cannon, and at the smaller points would be soldiers with rifles.
So if the army attacking, or the force attacking, hit the points, they'd face cannon fire, basically. And if they tried in the middle of the points, they would be facing rifle fire directly upon them by the defenders.
Precisely. And in the middle would be bomb-proof storage rooms for ammunition and food and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
The fort wasn't big enough for barracks. It was a pretty small fort. So the people who built the fort were mostly the New Mexico volunteers. And so they slept in tents outside of the fort. And so during the day, they would build the fort in hopes that they'd have it done before the Texans showed up, which they never showed up anyway because of Glorieta. But that and Fort Craig were the only two actual fortification-type forts built in New Mexico.
That was Fort Craig, and the first one you said was Fort
Union.
Union, okay.
Fort Union up by Las Vegas, and Fort Craig over by Socorro.
Okay. And you may have mentioned this before in one of your previous discussions, but are either one of those forts, are there any remnants of them that are still there? Are they historic sites at this point, or did they just kind of fade back into the landscape over time?
Well, they're still there. Fort Craig is now a Bureau of Land Management historic site. So it's all ruins now, but you can see the outlines. You can see where the earthworks are still standing.
Mm-hmm.
but there's no intact buildings. And what's interesting, some of those earthworks, they built up the dirt, but then they placed storage buildings for ammunition inside of the earthworks, which decreases the thickness. So if which wouldn't be an issue out here, but if they had done that in, say, on the East Coast, all it would take is for one solid shot to pass through the walls into the storage. But when the Texans had just 6-pounders and 12-pound howitzers, it was perfectly safe.
Mm-hmm.
Fort Union, the Star Fort was actually the second fort that Fort Union built. Well, the second fort at Fort Union. Fort Union was 3 different forts built one after the other. The first one was built in 1851. It was just wood log buildings built sort of like around a town square. And while they're still living in that, they built the second fort, the Star Fort, and that was only around during the Civil War. And then after the Civil War, they abandoned it and built the third fort, which was a very huge town built out of adobe bricks. And in fact, that's National Park Service National Park now.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can see where the Star Fort is because it's still kind of there.
Yeah.
And you can see where they would have put the cannons, where they would have tried to have a sort of defensive position to protect the area.
And did it seem like it was Texans never came, as you said, because of Glorieta, but did it seem to be a successful design for this part of the country or this territory, or? Oh no, okay. Not at all. They built it too close to the hills. And in fact, while they're building it, one of the officers dragged a cannon to the top of the hills and fired a solid shot into the fort itself. They of course had all the people evacuate away from it while they did that, but they demonstrated that if the Texans did come, they could have fired directly into the fort from the hills around it. So it was more designed for a frontal assault and not something like that. Interesting. We've got a little less than a minute left. I'm sure we'll continue on with this. Anything else you'd like to mention? I know your Honoring Artesia Veterans exhibit is underway. Yes, Honoring Artesia's Veterans. The exhibit, which contains photos of veterans from Artesia, veterans who lived in Artesia, veterans who were born in Artesia. And that is on display from November 11th to December 31st. And if you have family who served in the armed forces, Army, Navy, Marine Corps, Air Force, Coast Guard, Space